The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, you'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
Welcome back to Oxfordshire again, people, and to the district of Cherwell. Now, we've come westwards now, past Fencott and Murcott, into the next village over. And this one has a really interesting story to tell when it comes to the Otmoor Riots. We'll talk a bit about them as we walk around this place. And beginning at the playing field here, where a local football team play. And that team belongs to Charlton on Otmoor. Charlton on Otmoor, Free Peasants Farm on Ottersmoor. Next up in Cherwell, we continue to the west along the northern edge of Otmoor to the only one of its 7 towns to have the boggy fenlands name in its own. This is Charlton on Otmoor, which occupies a ridge of cornbrash on the edge of the moor. The Domesday Book records Charlton as Serlantone, and it's been variously spelt Cherlantona or Charlantone. In about 1190, a charter of Tame Abbey recorded it as Cherlington, and a charter of Sandford Preceptory recorded it as Cherlerton. It means Free Peasants Farm. This is one of the larger villages around Otmoor and has quite a bit of meat to it. It's not a short walking route, this one. On it, we're going to be encountering a 13th century church dedicated to St Mary the Virgin and a school which was built on a plot of land that once belonged to Otmoor itself. Charlton will forever be associated with the civil unrest that occurred on Otmoor in the 1830s. It was here where the Otmoor Association was formed in a former pub called the George and Dragon. The establishment of the association led to the Otmoor Riots, the opposition to plans drawn up to drain and enclose the moor. The rioters achieved their aim, and the villagers continued to farm a 4-field open system until a later attempt at enclosure was successful in 1858. The George and Dragon no longer exists, but the Crown still continues to trade. Oh, and late on in this video, we'll also get a look at a street name that features a great little bit of old Oxfordshire dialect. Is it an alleyway or is it a sewer? Well, nobody's really sure. Let's go. Our main walk begins at the playing field to the west of the main village cluster. It's a decent open space with a children's playground and a few football pitches. Now, speaking of football, it's used by the local side, Charlton United. Charlton United Football Club were founded in 1920. They're a friendly, all-inclusive club who are proudly run by the local community and volunteers who aim to provide a safe, fun, competitive environment for their 4 teams. They are the first team, the reserve team, the vets team, and an under-17 youth team. The club play in a blue and white kit, and with not many other local sides around Otmoor, they're considered the premier team in the area. Charlton on Otmoor sits on an unclassified road about 4 miles south of Bicester on the northern edge of Otmoor. It's one of the 7 towns of Otmoor, the others being Beckley, Oddington, Horton-cum-Studley, Noke, Murcott and Fencott. In the 17th century, apart from the rectory, there were 24 houses in Charlton. There's a fair few more than that these days. Today it has a population of over 400. No record exists of any manor house having ever existed in Charlton. The manor itself was recorded in the Domesday Book as being in the possession of Roger Divery on behalf of his father-in-law, Hugh de Grantmesnil. With Hugh's consent, it was later granted to St Everill Abbey in Normandy. Before enclosure in the early 1800s, any cottager who lived in one of the 7 towns had right of grazing for their cattle, sheep and geese on the moor. It's not surprising then that when the idea of enclosure was mooted, residents of Charlton were pretty annoyed. In 1830, it was here, in this very village, where the Otmoor Association was founded at the former George and Dragon pub, a 17th century public house that stood at the eastern end of the village, leading to the infamous Otmoor Riots. This was the action taken by local farmers in opposition to plans to drain and enclose Otmoor. The rioters achieved their objective, and the villagers continued to farm a 4-field open system until a subsequent attempt at enclosure in 1858 was successful. Keep that fact in mind for later. Okay, we're going to have a look at the church next, which is behind the camera currently, but in front of the camera here you can see the garage, and that belongs to Charlton Services. It's a bus company which runs around Otmoor and ends up in Oxford. It's an important service out here because, as far as public transport goes, there ain't much. We'll talk a bit more about this later though, because we need to go and see a railway line. I'll sort of group those two things together. Let's talk about the church. The centre of the village is dominated by the large Grade 1 listed 13th century church of St Mary the Virgin with its tall tower. Substantial alterations were carried out to the church in the 14th century, and there's been some further restoration since. Inside, the 15th century rood screen has finely decorated carved panels. The church has a tradition of decorating the rood screen with a floral garland on May the 1st every year. This is known as the Feast of the Dedication of the Church. It's an immemorial custom to carry the garland around the parish in a May Day procession. The garland is carried from the church to Studley Priory, accompanied by Morris dancers and villagers. The tower arch here is a good example of early 13th century work. Also of the 13th century is the lower part of the tower with a lancet window in the west wall, the south aisle with its plain doorway and porch, and the walls of the north aisle. The church has been little restored. In 1757 and 1807 the roof was repaired, and in 1771 a gallery was erected. The tower was repaired in 1954, and in 1955 the church was re-roofed and the plaster ceiling of the nave was totally removed to expose its medieval timbers. Also during that 1955 restoration, some ancient paintings were uncovered on the north and south walls of the nave. There are some fragments of stained glass in the chancel windows, including a medieval figure of the Virgin and Child and a shield to Joseph Williamson of the Queen's College in the east window. Now next up we're off to the local pub, and this ties in nicely with a bit of history we already know. When Charlton was possessed by Normandy, the Priory of Ware, which was a cell of the abbey, held the manor until it was suppressed in 1414. It would, after several legal disputes and wrangling, end up in the hands of Sir Edward Turner of Ambrosden. The Turner and later Page Turner family remained owners of the manor until 1874. In between times, the Crown kept it for a number of years, and it was used to secure loans for Elizabeth I in 1558 and 1560. Charlton's association with the Crown has never been forgotten, and that's reflected in the name of this pub. Some say the pub is full of history, although I found relatively little other than the link to its name. It has a great atmosphere and a good range of beers, apparently, but above all it's a welcoming pub on the edge of Otmoor. Some beautiful stone properties in this part of Oxfordshire, aren't there? There's another one there, right behind me. They're not all like this in Charlton and Otmoor. There is a modern section to it as well. We'll come to that in due course. We're almost at the end of the high street here. So if I just hop out of the way, you can see where we are. You can see up there in the distance, there's a junction. We're going to take a right turn at that junction, take us towards the cemetery. Next to pass is the cemetery, which is separate from the church. In actual fact, there are two cemeteries which are separate from the churchyard. This one is the much older, and the chances are you're not going to find any burial space in it these days. The newer one is on New Pond Lane, north of here, where residents of Charlton on Otmoor, Fencott and Mercott parishes have the right of interment. It's administered by Charlton on Otmoor Parish Council. If you look around this graveyard though, you might find the grave of Mrs. Sutherland, the wife of the local schoolmaster. It's the ideal place for her to be buried actually, because this cemetery is directly opposite the old schoolmaster's house. When the enclosure of Otmoor eventually happened in 1858, some land was set aside for the building of a school. That school would be built in 1866. Originally named Charlton Parochial School, both it and the master's house were built mostly at the expense of the rector. The number of pupils grew and a second classroom was added in 1892. It was reorganised as a junior school in 1937 and became a voluntary controlled school in 1951. That same establishment is now Charlton-on-Otmoor C of E. Over 100 children attend the school and preschool today. The original building now houses the foundation stage unit and the staff room. The school still possesses some old records and artefacts dating back to the early years, from which you can learn about the school life in the late 19th century. There were some similarities with the school today actually. Many of the children were from Charlton, but a number also came from the surrounding villages. Surnames like Honour, Franklin, Cooper, Turvey, Haynes, Busby and Collett were commonplace around here, and the school records show that. Today, Charlton C of E has children whose parents, grandparents and even great-grandparents attended the very same place. Since the 1860s, the local community and this school will have seen many changes, such as the occupations in the area, the increased use of cars and the two wars. There's also been some new buildings added and village shops have closed, but the community continues to evolve. On that note, the school has a brand new community hall which opened in 2002. It's used by the school and local villagers. It's a large hall with a kitchen and a meeting room, and the Otmoor branch of the WI meets monthly at it. Okay, so now we're starting to enter that more modern part of Charlton-on-Otmoor, the sort of northern section that runs around the back of the old bit we've already seen. Now this particular street here is called Mill Lane. Now Oxfordshire is not a kind of county that's sort of synonymous with windmills. You're not going to find many here, but that doesn't mean there weren't any in the past, and Otmoor had quite a few. Now one thing Otmoor had lots of were windmills. They were placed in various locations in and around the 7 towns. For example, at Beckley, there was one called the Lord's Mill in the 13th century, and a further mill existed there in the 17th, belonging to the vicar. Horton-cum-Studley also had 2 mills. Here in Charlton, there was a mill until early 1905. It was built possibly in about 1610, but nobody knows for sure the exact date. It was situated close to the modern Mill Lane. It no longer stands, but the mill mound or tump still exists. Okay, so we've hit a footpath here which will take us back to the high street, and this footpath in itself is a landmark that I want to talk about. You see, it's all to do with its name. There are places in and around Oxford and around Oxfordshire that have streets with a similar name to this, and it's got a very smelly and disgusting meaning, apparently. To return to the start, we have a fantastic piece of local dialect to digest. This little alleyway is called the Tchure. Tchure is a common Midlands dialect word for an alley, hence the name, and they can be found all over this part of the country. The Tchure here in Charlton is an old alleyway that's now a bridle way. Oxfordshire has identically named alleys in Kidlington and Upper Hayford. However, the word Tchure might actually mean something else. Some reckon it also means sewer, and probably the open kind, not uncommon in times before the Victorians pioneered the mains water systems we enjoy today. Could it possibly be, therefore, that once upon a time this pleasant little alley was covered in, well, you know what? If it was, it's certainly cleaned up its act now. When you think about the word Tchure and how it's spelt and pronounced, the idea of it being a sewer isn't all that misplaced. The word can be written and pronounced in several ways, including Tchure or Tchure, spellings which suggest the derivation of the word sewer. Lastly, we have an old chapel. Charlton had both Baptist and Methodist chapels once upon a time. There was a Methodist congregation here by 1829 and a chapel by 1840. The Methodist chapel had ceased to be used by the end of the 19th century and was sold to the rector in 1920 for use as a club room. As for the Baptist chapel, that closed in around 2010 and was later sold and converted to a residential property. Now, to finish with, as you know, I was supposed to go and see a railway line, but my plans were scuppered by a gate across this lane, which I knew nothing about beforehand. No matter, we'll see the line tomorrow anyway. Had I have been able to get through the gate, we'd have seen what remains of Charlton Holt, which used to be the station serving the village. The nearest railway station now is at Islip, 3 miles away from Charlton. While we're on the subject of public transport though, it's important to note that Charlton is quite famous for its bus service. The first regular bus service on Otmoor was started in the 1920s, and after a change of ownership in the 1950s, it was renamed Charlton Services. The company continues to provide Charlton on Otmoor and neighbouring villages with a service to Oxford via Islip. Phyllis Maycock was a bus conductor with Charlton Services for 49 years, retiring in December 1992. In the 1994 New Year's Honours List, Maycock was made an MBE for services to the bus industry. In that same year, Maycock starred in an episode of This Is Your Life. And we are done with Charlton on Otmoor, so it's time to keep heading west as we skirt the northern edge of the grassy wetland known as Otmoor. Tomorrow we're off to another of the 7 towns, and this one is perhaps the very village where the man who Otmoor is named after lived. Let's see, shall we? Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.